around the state. In addition to syringe exchange, we address Hep C. We address some of the other issues around connectivity for services. We help facilitate the creation of stronger partnerships so that the end user is not the consumer that doesn't know where to go for services, or they're sent from agency A to agency B, or we have agency A and agency B working against one another, thinking that they have to fight for the patient versus us figuring out how we can work better together. So I'm thinking some wonderful side effects can come out of this.
Oh, absolutely. And then when you talk about the inclusion of, I'm thinking, you know, most people, when they are in need, in crisis, and the fact that you brought up earlier, it's not just about the individual, it impacts their family members, their neighbors, their coworkers, and so many people first look for help is within the faith community. And so critical that they be at the table, so beyond the usual prescription of care. You know, now here's where you can go, and I can hold your hand as you go, and we can go together, those kinds of things. You know, and they can be confident that at the end of the journey, that person will get what they need and deserve.
Well, and someone has, I think that I've been of the thought that you always can contribute something, and I think when we think of giving, oftentimes in these situations, it's giving monetarily, but I think if we're really kind of looking at the community of care, I think it can be taking that person to that appointment. I mean, that's something that came about in some of the survey work that we did, is transportation continues to be a barrier. It doesn't matter if you're in an urban or in a rural setting. If you're an employer with having an employee who has these health needs, you know, one of the other things that came about is, you know, not being able to go to my doctor because of my work schedule. Or so we're recognizing very specific, kind of at a more granular level, barriers to care, but we also see some of those facilitators as well, and a lot of it has to do with some of those social aspects, which is why we included, as we were surveying, not just individuals living with HIV, but also their friends, their family members, because we wanted to hear from everyone, and then those who work in the field as well. So we want to be able to see not just a wraparound of services, but there's a community embracing anyone who's in need in a way that, like, what can you offer when this is the issue? And what does that look like for you? Right. Versus, like, we think you should do this.
Or you must
do this.
Right. And again, when you bring everybody in on the ground floor, they become a part of, and they get to the buy-in, they take ownership. You know, that belongs to me. This is my community. This is my family. Absolutely.
And, you know, while, of course, to provide new services, new funding is needed, and that's something that we're going to look at as well. We're working with national partners, AIDS, United, to see what the cost of mounting a syringe exchange program would be from a budgetary standpoint, and then what resources can be garnered to make that happen. But you know, we all know of instances where there are well-funded organizations that do a bad job at what they were funded to do. So it's not always about the funding. And so what we want to do is, through this process, is again, not provide technical assistance, but bring in those national providers that have just been waiting for an invitation to come and do this work. And I think we have some great people lined up. Carrie and Beth Meyerson have worked with the Harm Reduction Coalition, the CDC. There actually has always been funding available to address needle exchange or syringe exchange from the federal level. So, I mean, we've got some great things on tap, and it's just a matter of working with the communities to begin this conversation.
So, in the initial articles about the outbreak in Scott County, there were the large percentage that became positive through the sharing of needles to do this brand new drug that nobody had ever heard of.
Opana.
Upon that none of us, I mean, and I sit on the drug-free community council, and nobody there had heard of it. But anywho, there was also this talk of that some of the infections were caused from the drug-seeking behaviors. You know, I may start out with $10 to buy my drugs, but eventually that will run out. And so I began to engage in different behaviors. Some of those behaviors are sexual, some of those behaviors are criminal. And so in the cultivation of this, I understand it would be critical to bring in law enforcement, because with a needle exchange program, it's very interesting now, I'm kind of jumping, but I'll come back, that I find, okay, you know, every other corner store sells paraphernalia, drug paraphernalia. I don't care how many little signs you put on there that says for tobacco use only. It's drug paraphernalia. So they can legally sell that. I can go in there and I can buy it, come outside, and a police officer arrests me and take me to jail for having drug paraphernalia. And so, again, critical that law enforcement become involved, because what have you found to be their understanding of possession of paraphernalia?
Well, and I think there were more fears when when there was the unknown of really what does it mean. I think now that we actually have legislation in place, it's a little easier for them to understand. However, what I've heard, at least at a community level, with most, they're not even concerned at that point of that per se. It's more of their own safety. So if I am in a home where there's injection drug use, then my fear is more of being stuck versus worried about who's doing what, you know, like
Right. Makes sense.
So it's more their personal safety. At least that's the conversation that I'm hearing now. So I think that it really depends. I think again, it's that education, prevention piece of all aspects of this, and so. They actually requested that be part of some of the work that we're doing with the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and that they're educating their officers both at a community level as well, the law enforcement, as well as at the state police. So again, it's just learning what this means and what is the best practice to provide my civil service in a way that I'm not. I'm building that relationship. I'm engaging them, that sort of thing, and recognizing that.
Right. And another thing that I believe it'll help in our community. Right now, we're in conversation and planning for some wet housing, and St. Charles County is one of the last in the state to actually provide housing for active users, and there has been this fear up until now of any substance beyond alcohol. And so, of course, I'm at the table. All substances are equal as far as I'm concerned. And the need for the individual is the same. But I believe that this can help alleviate some of those fears as well. So, again, all things working together, all things working in the best interest of communities and moving communities forward.
I mean, I think you really can't even criticize that some of those reactions until an individual or an organization or a population can make an informed decision.
Absolutely.
And then you can hold them accountable for maybe, but I think that you have to give them not only information, but it has to be good evidence information, and also developing a way to have them see how could it fit versus this is what we think we should do. And so I think it's on both sides of the table. I think it's a matter of how we have those discussions so that they're productive versus, you know, that the battle of the wills.
Right.
Right. And in this plan for Scott County, How involved, how engaged, or do you even know, was the target population in all of the putting together of the plans and how we're going to do this, how we're going to address this? Because
I don't know.
Okay, you don't know.
I know
Okay.
that was an issue that we as a collective raised
Okay.
in the very beginning. How will you facilitate meaningful involvement from people who are newly infected, substance abusers? How will you assist? How will you facilitate a process to include them in this conversation?
Okay.
If that happened in Scott County, I'm sure it did in bites as the process unfolded.
Right.
I'm sure it did. But moving forward, the legislation is very clear that that should be part of what you do
Okay.
to build your process in your community. So lesson learned, experience learned.
We can take a lesson here. I'm always a real big advocate for that. But again, to keep in mind for our August 19th and 20th meeting, that the constituency needs to be at the table.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
In
I think that
significant numbers, if possible.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's only going to truly work if we can get as many people with I think that with a diverse point of view,
Absolutely.
and who are willing to contribute to the process and recognize that there are differences, and how can we just set those aside for a second to like look at what factors we can do together, collectively versus individually, and so it's developing that narrative together of what this should look like for this community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Exciting stuff.
Exciting, exciting, exciting. And so the other part of where I was going, don't think I forget about it, but the whole part, so you have this part of the population who became infected from needle sharing. Then you have this part of the population who became infected through sexual transmission. So have you found that to be a barrier in your discussions with other communities? Did it even come up?
No, it did.
It doesn't come up. Okay.
No, it did. It did.
did.
It
Okay,
did.
it
Actually,
did.
in the very first community conversation we had, it was in Southeast Indiana, which was planned, I think, well beyond what had happened. There was a local organization that provided services for individuals who were homeless, and recognizing they had at least one or two individuals who were HIV positive, and the organization was really struggling, even though they saw a great need because they had both adult men and women, some sort of barrier protection because they knew that sex was happening,
Right.
but making sure that people had the ability to protect themselves. And so the director of the organization had specifically said in our community conversation that anyone know how I can get condoms?
Right.
Well, just like that. And so even though there wasn't a lot of answers, at least with Tony and I, we then came back and started getting on the phone and saying, here's an organization down south that needs some condoms. Two phone call or one face-to-face conversation and one phone call, and we had two avenues to get those for that homeless organization. So, again, it's just building out the network even to like, okay, so nobody seems to have the resource here. Let's see who else does.
And I think the beauty and the irony in all of that is for a long-term HIV or long-time HIV service provider condom, that's routine. That's just part of what you do.
Exactly.
And so to know that someone in the state is challenged with where do I get condoms? A big thing in that, some phone calls we were able to make it happen, but is that just small bite of a larger microcosm, that there is really a lack of knowledge about things that are accessible.
Yes.
And as we start to have these
Absolutely.
conversations, we're learning that what we think is our, continuum, our system of care, there's some fragmented pieces to it. And as we build this process around syringe exchange, and like I mentioned before, some side effects can be to fix what we don't know is broken, and what you don't know, you don't know.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So as we are, the whole thing is to reduce the harm reduction piece. And so to be able to provide whatever that looks like for the individuals who are living the harm is critical. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so how many communities have you talked to thus far? And what have been some of the outcomes of those conversations?
Well, as far as our conversations have gone, we've only had a couple, but we have started having communities reach out to us just like